Well, welcome to another episode, everyone. Throughout this episode, we're going to talk about what is autism. We are. Autism was first identified by someone called Leo Connor in 1943 with 11 children. With these 11 children, he noticed that they seemed to have been having most joy and so on when they were spending time by themselves, playing with their own toys. And this is where the term autism came from, as autos is Greek for self, and then Leo kind of just put ism on the end, making it autism. So that's where the name originally comes from. It does. But at the same time, across in Austria, there was someone called Hans Asperger, who also had patients, but seemed very different to the 11 children of Leo Connor. So, around this time, it was said among the literature that approximately 1 in every 10,000 people in the world were autistic. It was seen as an extremely rare condition. And then a bit later on in 1952 time, it was seen as a psychiatric disorder, and anyone identified as such was sent into institutionalisation, which made them invisible to the public, which is why even in the mid-20th century it was such an unfamiliar disability, was autism. And around that time they were saying things such as anyone who is autistic can't have epilepsy at the same time, can't have ADHD, and so many other common comorbidities among the autistic population. So things were kept very narrow at the time. And also Leo Connor had a theory which he called the refrigerator mother theory, where what happened was he came up with the assumption that the cause of autism is by a child having unaffectionate parents who did not have much love or affection for their children. But each time the criteria changed and so on, the spectrum rather broadened a bit. So eventually when we got to the second set, it was reclassified as a developmental disability, which brought paediatricians into the picture, which brought people outside of institutionalisations into the picture, that more people were coming in. And then but all of Hans Asperger's work was being hidden and buried in the literature, but no one understood it. Everyone just thought it was these 1 in 10,000. But eventually in the 1970s and 80s, there was a woman called Lorna Wing, and she had a husband who could translate German into English. And they found a paper inside the medical literature which found Hans Asperger describing his patients as little geniuses. In a later episode, we'll be talking more about Hans Asperger due to some controversial issues, such as the reason he wrote in German is due to his relationship with the Nazis, of how all those who he called low function autism, he sent them to be killed in the clinic. We'll be discussing more about that later. And then once Lorna Wing had seen that, because she was the mother of an autistic daughter herself, and the refrigerator mother theory just seemed plain flawed to her, and she actually called him stupid over it. And then once she compared Dr. Hans Asperger's work, along with those of Leo Connor, she came up with a theory called the triad of impairments, where she said that all the autistic people have a difficulty with social communication, social interaction, and social imagination. And she saw that as the more rare by seeing Leo Connor's work and Hans Asperger's work, that broadened the spectrum more, showing it more diverse. Then when the fourth criteria came out, when she worked across both the British and the American, the American Psychological Association reclassified it as a spectrum disorder, which is what and then we had autism spectrum disorder, Kanner's syndrome, and Hans Asperger syndrome, named after the people who identified them. But at first, it was believed that it was just a boy's condition, such as so many of you might be familiar with the Light It Up Blue campaign by an organisation called Autism Speaks. The blue jigsaw piece actually has some offensive symbolism to it. The reason it's blue is because that represents the boys. So already from the beginning, half of the world's population, all females, were left out of the picture and said they can't be autistic. They never worthy of a diagnosis. And never beginning some said that if you are over 30 months old, you cannot have a diagnosis of autism. You cannot be autistic. So anyone who was over 2.5 years old, once they got to that stage, they can't be autistic. But then they reclassified that as if they're diagnosed after 30 months old with what we call pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. So at this point it was in 3 divisions. We had Connor's syndrome, named after Leo Connor, Asperger syndrome, named after Hans Asperger in Austria, and pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, when they wanted to broaden the spectrum again. And then at this point they began allowing females to be diagnosed that it was both a male and female disability all along, so that broadened the spectrum again. And in the 90s, when it was reclassified, this is when we began to see the autism rate skyrocket. Because now, rather than just having 1 in 10,000 people, we now had both males and females in the picture. It was people of all ages could be diagnosed. It wasn't so narrow just to kids who couldn't speak. Vocal people were allowed to be diagnosed as well now. Such we have lots of historical figures, such as the most common ones being people like Albert Einstein and Mozart. It said that they were autistic, but they never received a diagnosis due to the narrowness. So one of the purposes of this big prevalent increase in autism diagnosis is actually by all the changes to the criteria. Because at first it was seen as a mild form of schizophrenia. So anyone epileptic couldn't be diagnosed, but now that's a common comorbidity with autism. Anyone dyslexic could not be autistic, but a lot of autistic people today are dyslexic. Anyone autistic could not have gastrointestinal problems. So all of that has come out. And the big problem began in 2013 when we made the 5th edition of the autism criteria. What we've now done is they've clustered together lots of separate disabilities under one spectrum and called it autism. So if I ask someone what is autism, every individual will give me a different explanation. If they say to me things like, oh, it makes people go hypersensitive to lights and sounds, that's actually not autism, but it's something called sensory processing disorder. So now we're not talking about autism there. They may say things like IQ, but that's intellectual disability, that's not autism. And they say, oh, my child goes hyperactive with his motor abilities. That could be ADHD and not autism. So as I would say, a good analogy to describe it is that what we've done by clustering lots of disabilities together, just like where the Christian Bible is lots of separate books compiled into one volume, then just called the Bible, is basically the same way of what autism is today. We've put lots of different health disorders, disabilities, together compiled them all onto one, such as intellectual disability, schizophrenia, ADHD, bipolar, Down syndrome, all together, then called it autism spectrum disorder. So really, we still don't even know what autism is. And in 2012, someone called Dr. Damien Milton proposed what is now called the double empathy problem, and we're beginning to receive evidence that this shows that the psychiatric explanation of autism is partial at best, because they found that autistic people can socialise equally well with other autistic people, and non-autistic people struggle to socialise with autistic people, but all of it works in both directions. So Dr. Damien Milton has proposed that rather than it being social deficits that autistic people have in common, it's more to do with mutuality, the difference between it and reciprocity. So it's not actually due to social deficits, is what evidence is beginning to show. So autism once again is shifting target, shifting its definition. So altogether we still don't really know what autism is. So this is what I see one of the dangerous things about trying to eradicate it. How can we try and prevent something if we haven't even identified it yet? How could we cure something that we haven't identified? So I think looking for cures and so on at the minute before we've even identified it is not a very wise idea. So I think more research should be put towards identifying it, as all disorders have a common denominator. Like with epilepsy, all people diagnosed with epilepsy have epileptic seizures. All people with gastrointestinal problems have a problem with their intestines. There's a common denominator among it all, but there's still no found common denominator among people diagnosed with autism. And autism is known to be primarily genetic, but all the criteria is a list of behaviours. It's actually got nothing to do with genes or the brain, or the diagnostic criteria. So it is not actually an increase in the occurrence of autism, but it's actually an increase in diagnosis and an expansion of how long the spectrum is, and so on. Because genomic research shows that autism has actually existed among the human race before we even evolved into humans. So autism's always been here, but we just didn't recognise it as autism yet, until around 1943 by Leo Connor and Hans Asperger. So I can assure you all that there is no autism epidemic going around us. So if anyone's spreading this rumour that autism's an epidemic, make sure you know it's just a metaphor. There is no genetic epidemic. That's literally impossible. So as a short answer, we still don't know what autism is yet. We shall discuss more about autism on later episodes. Thank you for listening. If you found this interesting, please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you on a later episode. Thank you.